I was 28 years old when I inherited my uncle's Malibu mansion, and I thought I had won the lottery. Standing in the marble foyer of the sprawling estate that overlooked the Pacific Ocean, I couldn't believe that Alexander Blackwood, the legendary defense attorney who had dominated Los Angeles courtrooms for 3 decades, had left everything to me, his quiet niece who taught elementary school in Portland. "Are you sure there wasn't a mistake?" I asked Jennifer Walsh, Uncle Alex's longtime personal attorney, as she handed me the keys to the house that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. "I mean, we were close, but I always assumed he'd leave everything to charity or something." Jennifer smiled, though there was something strained about her expression. "Alexandra, your uncle was very specific. He said you were the only family member with enough integrity to handle his legacy properly." Integrity. That was such an Uncle Alex word. Growing up as Alexandra Reed in a working-class family in Riverside, I had idolized my mother's younger brother from the moment I could understand what he did for a living. While my parents struggled to make ends meet, my father worked construction, my mother cleaned houses, Uncle Alex lived like a movie star, driving Ferraris and representing celebrities and politicians in high-profile criminal cases. But it wasn't the money that had captured my imagination as a child. It was his passion for justice, his ability to stand in front of a jury and argue so compellingly that innocent people walked free while the guilty were held accountable. He was everything I thought a hero should be: brilliant, eloquent, and uncompromisingly moral. "Some lawyers chase money," he had told me when I was 16, during one of his rare visits to our modest house. "But the law is about truth, Alexandra, about making sure the system works for everyone, not just the powerful." That conversation had inspired me to apply to UCLA pre-law, though I'd ultimately switched to education after realizing I didn't have his gift for oral argument. Uncle Alex had been disappointed, but supportive, paying for my student loans and encouraging me to change the world one classroom at a time. Now, walking through his house for the first time as its owner, I felt the weight of that legacy. The walls were covered with photographs of him with governors, movie stars, and Supreme Court justices. His study contained hundreds of law books, trial transcripts, and awards from various bar associations. This was the home of a man who had spent his life fighting for justice. "There is one thing," Jennifer said as we stood in the kitchen, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the meticulously maintained garden. Alexander left specific instructions about the grounds. He was very particular about the landscaping, especially the area behind the pool house. He said under no circumstances should anyone dig or make changes to that section. I looked out at the garden, which stretched for nearly an acre behind the house. It was beautiful. Professionally maintained roses, a meditation area with a small fountain, and in the far corner, a secluded section surrounded by tall hedges that blocked the view from the main house. "That's a little odd," I said. "Why would he care so much about landscaping?" Jennifer's expression grew uncomfortable. "Your uncle could be eccentric about certain things. I'd recommend following his wishes." After Jennifer left, I spent the evening exploring my inheritance. The house was immaculate, as if Uncle Alex had been preparing for my arrival. His bedroom contained dozens of expensive suits, all perfectly pressed. His bathroom held toiletries that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Everything spoke to a life of precision, success, and careful attention to detail. But it was in his study that I found the first hint that something wasn't quite right. Among the law books and case files, I discovered a locked filing cabinet that hadn't been mentioned in the will. The key wasn't among the others Jennifer had given me, so I assumed it contained personal documents or perhaps sensitive client information that would eventually be handled by his law firm. What bothered me more was what I found in his desk drawer, a prescription bottle for anxiety medication, filled just 2 weeks before his death from a sudden heart attack. Uncle Alex had always seemed unshakable, completely in control. The idea that he'd been struggling with anxiety in his final weeks was troubling. That night, I called my mother from Uncle Alex's king-sized bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than my car. "Honey, I'm so happy for you," my mother said, though I could hear the weariness in her voice. At 55, she was still cleaning houses, her hands permanently stained from chemicals and her back aching from years of physical labor. "Alex always said you were special. I think he wanted to make sure you never had to struggle the way your father and I did." "Mom, was Uncle Alex ever married? Did he have any close relationships?" It seems strange that he lived alone in this huge house. There was a pause before she answered. Your uncle was very dedicated to his work. He said the law was a jealous mistress that didn't leave room for much else. But he must have dated someone. He was handsome, successful. Alexandra, your uncle was a private man. He didn't share everything with family. After ending the call, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bedroom, listening to the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Something about my mother's tone had been off, as if she were avoiding discussing Uncle Alex's personal life. The next morning, I decided to explore the garden that had been so important to my uncle. The main area was stunning, clearly maintained by professional landscapers who understood both aesthetics and horticulture. But as I approached the secluded section behind the pool house, I noticed something strange. The soil in this area looked different from the rest of the garden. While the other flower beds had the rich, dark earth of well-composted soil, this section had a paler, more compact appearance, as if it had been recently disturbed and then carefully replanted. More disturbing were the plants themselves. While the rest of the garden featured roses, lavender, and other decorative flowers, this hidden section was planted entirely with white lilies, dozens of them, arranged in what looked almost like rows. I knelt down to examine the soil more closely and noticed something metallic glinting just beneath the surface. Using a small garden trowel I'd found in the pool house, I brushed away some dirt and uncovered what appeared to be a piece of jewelry, a small gold earring in the shape of a heart. My hands began to tremble as I held the earring up to the morning light. It was delicate, clearly expensive, and definitely not something that would have been dropped accidentally by a gardener. Someone had been wearing this earring when it ended up buried in my uncle's garden. I stood up quickly, dropping the earring as if it had burned me. Jennifer's warning echoed in my mind. Under no circumstances should anyone dig or make changes to that section. But it was too late. I had already begun to dig, and what I'd found raised questions that I couldn't ignore. My phone rang, startling me. It was my principal, calling to check on when I'd be returning to Portland. I might need a few more days, I told her, staring at the white lilies that now looked less like a memorial garden and more like markers for something much darker. There are some family matters I need to resolve. After ending the call, I picked up the gold earring and walked back to the house. In Uncle Alex's study, I opened his computer. The password was Justice1, and began searching for any information about missing persons cases in Los Angeles, specifically women who had disappeared while wearing gold jewelry. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, 12 young women had disappeared in the Los Angeles area. All were between the ages of 18 and 25. All had been involved in legal proceedings, some as witnesses, others as victims of crimes, still others as defendants in minor cases, and every single one of them had been represented at some point by Alexander Blackwood. I counted the rows of white lilies in my mind. 12 rows, 12 missing women, 12 clients who had trusted my hero uncle with their lives and their secrets. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, casting long shadows across the garden I now viewed with horror, I realized that the legacy Uncle Alex had left me wasn't a gift, it was a confession. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Uncle Alex's study until dawn, systematically going through every file, every document, every scrap of paper that might explain what I'd discovered in his garden. The locked filing cabinet haunted me. I was convinced it held the answers I was terrified to find. At 6 a.m., I drove to a hardware store in Santa Monica and bought a crowbar. My hands shook as I paid the cashier, a teenage boy who probably wondered why an elementary school teacher needed tools for breaking and entering at sunrise. Back at the house, it took me 20 minutes to work up the courage to actually break open the cabinet. When the lock finally gave way, the metal door swung open to reveal 3 shelves of meticulously organized files, each labeled with a woman's name and date. The first file I opened was labeled Maria Santos, March 2019. Inside were photographs, not crime scene photos, but candid shots that looked like they'd been taken without the subject's knowledge. Maria walking to her car, Maria at a coffee shop, Maria entering what appeared to be a courthouse. There were also copies of legal documents showing that she'd been a witness in a domestic violence case where Uncle Alex had represented the defendant. At the bottom of the file was a handwritten note in Uncle Alex's careful script. MS became problematic after changing her testimony. Potential witness tampering charges. Resolved, March 15th. March 15th, 2019 was the date Maria Santos had been reported missing. My stomach lurched as I reached for the next file. Jennifer Kim, August 2018. More surveillance photos, more legal documents, more notes in Uncle Alex's handwriting. Jennifer had been a plaintiff in a sexual harassment case against one of Uncle Alex's corporate clients. Her file contained draft motions to have her testimony excluded, private investigator reports about her personal life, and financial records showing unusual monetary transfers. The final note read, J.K. refused settlement offer, threatened to go public with additional allegations. Resolved, August 22nd. I opened file after file, each one telling the same horrifying story. These weren't random victims. They were women who had posed threats to Uncle Alex's cases, his clients, or his reputation. Women who had refused to be silenced by legal maneuvering or financial pressure. Women who had been resolved. The most devastating file was the last one I opened, Rebecca Martinez, November 2021. Rebecca had been 19 years old, a college student who'd witnessed a hit-and-run accident involving the son of a prominent politician. Uncle Alex had been hired to defend the young man, and Rebecca's testimony would have sent him to prison. Her file contained a different kind of documentation, not just surveillance photos and legal strategies, but detailed plans, maps of her daily routes, schedules of her classes, information about her family and friends. There were also photographs of the garden, showing the precise location where she would be buried. At the bottom of Rebecca's file was something that made me throw up in Uncle Alex's expensive trash can, a video file on a USB drive labeled Insurance. With shaking hands, I inserted the drive into Uncle Alex's computer. The video showed his study, filmed from the perspective of someone sitting behind his desk. Rebecca Martinez sat in the chair where I'd sat yesterday, crying and pleading. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she said through her tears. "I just want to tell the truth about what I saw. That boy killed someone and drove away. His family's money shouldn't protect him from justice." Uncle Alex's voice came from behind the camera, calm and reassuring. "Rebecca, I understand your position, but sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. The Hendersons are prominent philanthropists. Their son made a mistake, but destroying their family won't bring back the victim. So you want me to lie? I want you to consider the broader implications of your testimony. However, I can see you're not amenable to reason." The video showed Uncle Alex standing up and moving toward Rebecca. She started to rise from her chair, alarmed by something in his expression, but the footage cut off abruptly. I sat in stunned silence, staring at the blank screen. The man I'd idolized my entire life, the champion of justice I'd wanted to emulate, had been systematically murdering women who threatened his perfect win record. My phone rang, startling me out of my horrified trance. It was Jennifer Walsh, Uncle Alex's attorney. "Alexandra, how are you settling into the house?" she asked, though her tone suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. "Fine," I managed, though my voice sounded strange even to me. "Actually, I have some questions about Uncle Alex's cases. I found some files that seem unusual." There was a long pause before Jennifer responded. "What kind of files?" "Files about missing women. Women who were involved in his cases." Another pause, longer this time. "Alexandra, I think we should meet. Today. There are some things about your uncle that you need to understand." "What kinds of things?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me at my office in Beverly Hills at 2 p.m.? After ending the call, I realized that Jennifer's reaction hadn't been surprise. It had been fear. She knew about Uncle Alex's activities, which meant I wasn't the first person to discover his secrets. I spent the next few hours copying all the files from the locked cabinet onto external drives, then hiding the copies in multiple locations around the house. If something happened to me, I wanted evidence to remain. At 1:30 p.m., I drove to Beverly Hills, my mind racing with questions. How long had Jennifer known? Was she complicit in the murders, or just aware of them? And most importantly, what did she plan to do now that I'd discovered the truth? Jennifer's law office occupied the top floor of a gleaming building on Rodeo Drive. When I arrived, her secretary directed me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Jennifer was waiting for me, along with a man I didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of predatory alertness that made me immediately nervous. "Alexandra, this is Detective Raymond Torres with the LAPD," Jennifer said. "Ray, This is Alexander's niece. My heart stopped. If Torres was a real detective, then Jennifer had called the police about my discovery. But if he wasn't... Ms. Reed, Torres said, extending his hand. I understand you've been going through your uncle's papers. I didn't take his hand. Are you here to arrest me for breaking into my own filing cabinet? Torres smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm here because your uncle and I had an understanding. He provided valuable services to certain individuals in this city, and in return, those individuals ensured that his activities remained private. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Uncle Alex hadn't been operating alone. He'd had protection from within the police department. Torres wasn't here to investigate the murders. He was here to continue covering them up. Services? I repeated. You mean murdering witnesses? I mean solving problems that the legal system couldn't handle, Torres said smoothly. Your uncle understood that sometimes justice requires alternative methods. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression earnest. Alexandra, your uncle left you his estate because he trusted you to understand that some secrets are bigger than individual conscience. The people he helped, politicians, judges, business leaders, they're the foundation of this city's prosperity. So you're asking me to keep quiet about the fact that he was a serial killer? We're asking you to consider the broader implications of going public, Torres said. Your uncle's client list reads like a who's who of Los Angeles power brokers. Exposing his methods would destabilize the entire legal and political system. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. And if I don't agree to keep quiet? Torres and Jennifer exchanged a look that answered my question more clearly than words could have. Alexandra, Jennifer said gently, your uncle cared about you very much. He wouldn't want anything to happen to you. But there are forces larger than personal affection at work here. I left the meeting without saying another word, my mind reeling with the realization that Uncle Alex's corruption went far beyond a few murdered women. He'd been part of a system that protected the powerful by eliminating threats, and that system was still operational. As I drove back to Malibu, I knew I had a choice to make. I could accept the blood money of my inheritance and spend the rest of my life living off the proceeds of murder. Or I could risk everything to expose the truth about the man I'd once idolized. But first, I needed to know exactly how many bodies were buried in that garden. That night, I stood in Uncle Alex's garden under the light of a full moon, holding a flashlight and the small shovel I'd used to uncover the earring. Every rational part of my brain screamed that I should call the FBI, turn over the files, and let professionals handle the excavation. But Torres's veiled threats had made it clear that law enforcement couldn't be trusted. I needed proof, undeniable evidence that would be impossible to cover up or dismiss. Starting with the section where I'd found the earring, I began carefully removing soil from around the white lilies. What I discovered made me understand the full scope of Uncle Alex's methodical nature. The bodies weren't simply buried randomly. They were arranged in a precise grid pattern, each grave exactly 6 feet apart, each marked by a lily plant that had been carefully maintained to hide the disturbed earth beneath. Uncle Alex had turned murder into a landscaping project. 3 feet down in the first grave, I found human remains wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic sheeting. Alongside the bones was a small waterproof container holding a driver's license and other personal items. The license belonged to Maria Santos, the woman whose file I'd read that morning. As I moved from grave to grave, a horrifying pattern emerged. Uncle Alex hadn't just killed these women. He'd preserved their identities, as if maintaining some kind of macabre trophy collection. Each grave contained not only remains, but also personal effects, jewelry, photographs, driver's licenses, even cell phones in waterproof containers. But it was in the 7th grave that I found something that changed everything I thought I knew about my uncle's crimes. Alongside the remains of a young woman named Ashley Chen was a manila envelope containing hundreds of photographs and documents. Unlike the surveillance photos in the office files, these were intimate images, clearly taken inside Uncle Alex's house. Ashley hadn't been murdered immediately after refusing to cooperate. She'd been held captive, possibly for weeks or months. The photographs showed her in various rooms of the house, always wearing the same clothes, always looking terrified. There were images of her in the guest bedroom, the kitchen, even sitting in Uncle Alex's study. The dates on the photos spanned 3 months, from her initial disappearance in February 2020 to her presumed death in May. My hands shook as I realized the implications. The house I'd been sleeping in, the rooms I'd been walking through, they had been a prison for these women before becoming their tomb. I found similar evidence in several other graves. Uncle Alex hadn't simply been eliminating problematic witnesses. He'd been holding them captive, possibly torturing them psychologically before ultimately killing them. The man who had taught me about justice and integrity had been operating his own private dungeon just miles from where I'd grown up. By dawn, I had documented 12 graves, each containing remains and personal effects that corresponded to the files in Uncle Alex's office. But as I prepared to refill the graves and plant evidence of my night's work, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There was a 13th lily plant in the corner of the garden, newer than the others. The soil around it looked recently disturbed, and unlike the other plants, this one wasn't thriving. Its leaves were yellowing, as if it had been planted by someone less skilled than the professional landscapers who'd maintained the rest. I began digging frantically, terrified of what I might find but unable to stop. 3 feet down, I hit something solid, but not a body. Instead, I uncovered a metal box containing documents, cash, and a letter addressed to me in Uncle Alex's handwriting. My dearest Alexandra, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about my activities and chosen to investigate further rather than simply accepting Jennifer's explanations. I'm not surprised. You always were too curious for your own good. By now you've realized that my career was built on more than legal expertise. The women buried in this garden represented threats to cases that couldn't be resolved through traditional means. I want you to understand that I took no pleasure in their deaths, but sometimes justice requires sacrifices that the system cannot officially acknowledge. The box you're holding contains $2 million in cash, account information for offshore funds totaling another $8 million, and detailed information about my associates in law enforcement and politics who have benefited from my services. Consider this my final gift to you, the power to either continue my work or destroy it completely. You have 3 choices: accept the inheritance and the responsibilities that come with it, take the money and disappear to somewhere my associates cannot reach you, or attempt to expose the truth and face the consequences. Choose wisely. The system I helped build is larger than any individual, including you. With love and regret, Uncle Alexander P.S. The 13th grave is not what you think. Look deeper. My hands trembling, I continued digging beneath the metal box. What I found wasn't human remains. It was surveillance equipment, cameras, recording devices, and transmission equipment that had apparently been monitoring the entire property. Every move I'd made since inheriting the house had been watched and recorded. As this realization hit me, I heard the sound of cars pulling into the driveway. Through the hedges, I could see black SUVs surrounding the house. Torres and his associates had apparently decided that I'd learned too much to be allowed to leave with my knowledge. I grabbed the metal box and ran toward the cliff edge behind the garden. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before me, waves crashing against the rocks 100 feet below. Behind me, I could hear voices shouting, car doors slamming, the sounds of people searching the house. My phone had 1 bar of signal. With shaking fingers, I opened the voice recording app and began to speak. My name is Alexandra Reed. I'm at 1247 Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, and I've discovered that my uncle, attorney Alexander Blackwood, was a serial killer who murdered at least 12 women and buried them in his garden. He was working with corrupt police officers, including Detective Raymond Torres, who are now trying to silence me. I detailed everything I'd found: the files, the graves, the evidence of captivity, Uncle Alex's confession letter. As I spoke, I could hear my pursuers getting closer. I'm uploading this recording to cloud storage and sending copies to multiple news outlets, I continued, though I wasn't sure I'd have time to actually do so. If something happens to me, please know that this information is accurate and that there are forces in Los Angeles willing to kill to keep it secret. I ended the recording and began frantically sending it to every contact in my phone: my principal, my mother, my college friends, even people I barely knew. Some might dismiss it as crazy rambling, but someone would listen. Torres's voice cut through the morning air. Ms. Reed, we know you're out there. Let's discuss this reasonably. No one needs to get hurt. Looking at the cliff below and the approaching voices behind me, I realized that Uncle Alex had been right about one thing. I did have a choice to make, but unlike him, I was going to choose justice over self-preservation, even if it killed me. I didn't jump. Instead, I climbed down the rocky cliff face, using handholds I remembered from childhood visits to Uncle Alex's house. My phone had uploaded the recording to 3 news outlets, and the FBI tip line before Torres's team could find me. Hidden in a cave 20 feet below the garden, I called my mother while the corrupt cops searched above. "Mom, I need you to listen carefully. Uncle Alex wasn't the man we thought he was." Through tears, I told her everything. The bodies, the files, the systematic murder of women who threatened his cases. My mother's silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "I know," she finally whispered. "I've known for years." "What?" "Your father and we suspected. Women kept disappearing after dealing with Alex's cases. But he was family, and we had no proof, and—" Her voice broke. "We were cowards, Alexandra. We chose willful ignorance over facing the truth." The recording I'd uploaded was picked up by investigative journalist Sarah Manning from the Los Angeles Times within 6 hours. Manning had been investigating disappearances of young women for years, and my uncle's name had appeared in her research repeatedly. While Torres and his team searched for me, Manning and FBI agents were obtaining warrants for the Malibu property. By sunset, federal investigators were excavating Uncle Alex's garden under floodlights, uncovering 12 bodies exactly where I'd told them to look. The investigation exploded outward from there. Uncle Alex's client files revealed a network of corruption spanning decades. Judges who had dismissed cases in exchange for campaign contributions, prosecutors who had buried evidence, police officers who had misdirected investigations. The services my uncle had provided weren't just murders. He'd been the architect of systematic justice obstruction for Los Angeles's elite. Torres was arrested at his home 3 days later, along with 5 other LAPD officers and 2 judges. Jennifer Walsh disappeared, though federal agents found evidence suggesting she'd been laundering money for Uncle Alex's operation through her law practice. I testified before a federal grand jury for 8 hours, detailing everything I'd discovered in that garden. The prosecutors called it the largest corruption case in California history. Dozens of indictments, hundreds of cases being reopened. Millions of dollars in settlements for victims' families. But the personal cost was devastating. My mother had to face the fact that she'd suspected her brother was a killer and done nothing. My father, construction worker though he was, had been right about his bad feelings regarding Uncle Alex. Feelings he'd never voiced because of our family's admiration for the successful lawyer. The media attention was overwhelming. Elementary teacher exposes serial killer uncle became a national story. I couldn't return to my quiet life in Portland. Reporters followed me everywhere, and death threats from Uncle Alex's remaining associates forced me into witness protection for 6 months. In the end, 12 families got closure they'd been denied for years. Maria Santos's sister Carmen, whom I met during the trial, hugged me and said, "Your uncle took my sister from us, but you gave her back her name. You let the world know she mattered." The house in Malibu was sold, with proceeds going to a victims' compensation fund. The garden was completely excavated and turned into a memorial park with 12 trees planted where the graves had been, one for each woman Uncle Alex had murdered. Uncle Alex's law firm dissolved amid the scandal. His famous cases were reviewed, revealing that his legendary courtroom victories had often been achieved through witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and in some cases, murder. Dozens of wrongfully convicted people were exonerated. Dozens of criminals who'd escaped justice were finally prosecuted. 2 years later, I stood in that memorial park during a ceremony honoring the 12 victims. Their families were there, along with journalists, federal agents, and community leaders who spoke about the importance of speaking truth to power. Sarah Manning, the journalist who'd broken the story, approached me afterward. "You know," she said, "your uncle taught you something valuable, even if he didn't intend to." "What's that?" "That justice isn't about being the smartest person in the courtroom or having the most influential friends. It's about being willing to do the right thing, even when it costs you everything." I never returned to teaching elementary school. Instead, I went to law school, not to follow in Uncle Alex's footsteps, but to help clean up the mess he'd made. I specialized in wrongful conviction cases and victims' rights, using the legal knowledge he'd inspired me to gain for the justice he'd spent his life perverting. The $10 million Uncle Alex had mentioned in his letter. It was seized by federal authorities and distributed to victims' families. I didn't want a penny of blood money, but I did keep something from his estate, a photograph of us from when I was 8 years old, standing in his garden where I'd later find 12 graves. Not as a memento of admiration, but as a reminder that evil often wears familiar faces, speaks in trusted voices, and hides behind noble causes. The uncle who had taught me to believe in justice had been justice's greatest enemy. But his crimes hadn't destroyed my faith in the legal system. They'd taught me that the system only works when people are willing to fight for it, even against those they love. 5 years after that morning in Uncle Alex's garden, I argued my 50th wrongful conviction case before the California Supreme Court. As I stood at the podium, speaking for a man who'd been framed by one of Uncle Alex's associates, I thought about the women buried under those white lilies. They hadn't gotten justice in life, but their deaths had exposed a corruption network that had poisoned the legal system for decades. In the end, they'd accomplished what Uncle Alex had spent his career preventing. They'd made sure the truth came to light. I still carry the gold earring I found that first morning. Not Maria Santos's earring, but one that belonged to Rebecca Martinez, the 19-year-old college student who just wanted to tell the truth about a hit and run. She'd been the youngest victim, the one whose courage in the face of Uncle Alex's threats had inspired me to keep digging when everyone else wanted me to stop. Some secrets are too devastating to keep, no matter how much we love the people who created them. The uncle I'd admired had been a monster, but exposing his crimes had revealed something else, that even ordinary people, like elementary school teachers, can choose justice over comfort, truth over family loyalty. That's the real legacy Uncle Alex left me. Not wealth or connections or legal expertise, but the knowledge that heroism isn't about being perfect or powerful. It's about being willing to do what's right, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The garden where 12 women died is now a place where their families can remember them with dignity. And every tree planted there stands as proof that the truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually bloom in the light.